Folks, I think it's time to put some claims to the test. You see, a few months ago, we covered Intel's 11th gen launch for laptops. And well, they did exactly what every other company does, which is putting a pretty little presentation that showed how much better the new stuff was. The real problem in these situations is that, unlike on desktop side, comparing equally spec laptops from different generations is almost impossible. There are rarely two products from different years with the exact same specs, so independently verifying those fancy slides is really tough. I mean, trust me, we've tried and tried, but that's actually about to change. So what I have in front of me are two AORUS 15P laptops. Now, as you can probably tell, I only have one sitting in front of me, but I also have another one hidden right over here, which, you know, both of these have pretty much the same specs, except the major difference is that this one has Intel's 10th gen Core i7 10750H or 10870H, and then this one has the 11th gen Core i7 11800H. Anyways, this is going to set the stage for a real apples to apples comparison to see if Intel's claims are actually true. And I know what some of you guys probably might be thinking. You see, based on what happened on the Rocket Lake desktop side, you probably might have written off Intel's 11th gen mobile CPUs as well. However, I have to say, these new laptop chips are actually very different little beasts, since they're based off Intel's 10nm Tiger Lake architecture rather than Rocket Lake's mashup of an old manufacturing process and some new tech. And let me tell you, that does end up leading to some surprising, impressive, but also pretty interesting results. So let's get to that, but first, a quick word from our sponsor.
You think you can escape brand loyalty? Not today. Introducing the full Origin series of gaming goodies by Thermaltake. They have it all to satisfy your gaming station. The full-size keyboard with that unique dual-tone design, the two ambidextrous loaded mouse options, wired and wireless, the smooth mousepad with RGB of course, the mouse bungee to eat your cable for control, the H5 headset with powerful high-res audio, and the pretty headset stand to tie everything together. Do you even game, bro? Become an Argent yourself. Check these out below.
Alright, so let's set the stage here, because as I mentioned earlier, this comparison wasn't easy to do, and I have to thank Gigabyte and AORUS for stepping up in a big way. They're actually supporting this video by providing these two laptops. So the 2020 15P was a tough one, since the config that I have over here wasn't actually available in every region. Now, about that 15P, well, it might look a lot like the 15G I reviewed last year, but it actually is a bit different. While the 15G focuses on being one of the thinnest and lightest gaming notebooks around, it also makes some sacrifices by using some lower power limits for its CPU and GPU. It's still an awesome device, but I think the 15P takes things to a whole new level by sacrificing a bit of thickness and weight, and then goes balls to the walls with performance. But between the 2020 and 2021 models, there are more similarities than anything, since other than the updated CPU, it's got a faster 360 Hz display option. So basically, it's just a spec refresh. It still has a ton of connectivity, including Wi-Fi 6, UHS 2 card reader, and more in a frame that weighs less than 5 pounds. Even from the outside, these are identical laptops, and you honestly just can't tell huge difference between the two, other than Intel's 11th gen Core badge on the palm rest. I mean, why mess up a pretty good design, right? Now, on paper, if I were to put these two head to head, well, they're pretty much identical, with the major changes being the Tiger Lake platform's higher memory speed and its ability to support Gen 4 NVMe SSDs. AORUS has also increased the battery capacity by a small amount, going from 94 watt-hours to 99 watt-hours, but that's it as far as differences go. I do need to mention that some of the models of the 15P come with the 16GB version of the RTX 3080, whereas both samples that we have over here have the RTX 3080 with 8GB. I also want to take a quick detour and talk about the two CPUs inside both these laptops, specifically because that's what we're all here for. You see, the Core i7 11800H is pretty much a direct successor to the i7 10870H in the older model. Both have the same 8-core 16-thread layout, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. The older CPU actually has a technical clock speed advantage, since it's got Intel's Turbo Boost Max 3.0 and thermal velocity boost, whereas the 11800H doesn't. So I think most of the advantage here is going to come right from that Tiger Lake architectural improvements. We also can't forget that one of the major inclusions in the 11800H is 24 megabytes of smart cache, which will help things like gaming a lot. Drilling even further down into how these CPUs behave, after an initial spike at the beginning of any CPU load, the AORUS 15P runs the 10870H at a completely static 70 watts in its boost mode. Meanwhile, when you look at the 2021 version, well, it's exactly the same at about 70 watts throughout the entire test in creator mode. Also, if you're wondering about that higher PL2 state from the 10870H at the beginning, it's because of Intel's Turbo Boost Max 3.0 and Thermal Velocity Boost. Even running at 70 watts, the 10870H is really well cooled and it sticks to a max of 90 degrees before falling to a more steady 77 degrees. The 11th gen 11800H is a bit more interesting since it hits that 90-degree mark for a little bit longer, and after that, its temperatures are generally a degree or two higher, and there's a lot more movement in its readout. This just goes to show what we've been saying for a while now. The amount of power given to laptop hardware is almost always determined by the design rather than component limits. The last stop on this quick ride is the GPU, and yes, it's a big one since I've already talked about how hard it is to compare identical chips. I actually went on a rant talking about how an RTX 3060 in a design that allows 120 watts usually beats an RTX 3070 running at about 90 watts. The 3080 versus 3070 situation would be the same as well. So things like these just makes comparing GPUs or GPUs inside laptops just super hard. But it wasn't actually that hard getting the 215Ps to behave identically. Setting the 10870H version to the GPU's turbo mode got it running along at an average of 122 watts through our testing. Now on the i7 11800H system, I needed to use a new gaming mode, and that allowed the RTX 3080 to hit the same average with a variance of only a watt or two. And if you're wondering about frequencies, well, both 3080s registered a continual speed of about 1650 megahertz. How that all translates into benchmarks is really something to see, but I also need to mention this is an architecture comparison, not a review where I'm comparing a ton of laptops. Starting with Cinebench, and I really thought this one would be a bit closer since the 10870H peaked at a higher wattage and it's rated for slightly higher frequencies as well. But in the multi-core test, well, it wasn't even close. Moving on to single-core results, and we already knew this was coming. Tiger Lake is a beast when it comes to lightly threaded workloads, guys. And remember, most of these increases are coming from the new architecture, not more power. In other heavy multi-threaded results, it's more of the same with the 11800H just dominating everywhere. Now, I can't stress how important this is for Intel since they've leveraged more cache and better overall core performance for some massive boosts where they needed it the most. And that's sort of a big deal, guys. But when you add GPU accelerated apps into the mix, the 11800H still wins, but not by nearly as much. The reason for this is pretty straightforward. In Premiere and Resolve, it's the GPU that's important, but it can also cause a pretty big bottleneck regardless of the processor you're rocking. So I guess that establishes the 11800H as probably one of the biggest generational jumps forward Intel has had on the laptop side in the last few years. I mean, the numbers really do speak for themselves. However, what happens in gaming? I mean, these are gaming laptops, both rocking a 120-watt RTX 3080. So let's see how that checks out. Let's start with CSGO, and I actually thought this was a mistake, so I ended up testing it over and over again on both 15Ps. But every time, it was the same thing. Looking back, I think this sort of reflects what I saw with the single-core results. Tiger Lake is just really good in single-core workloads. So in CPU-limited games that favor strong, lightly threaded performance, the i7 11800H or any 11th gen CPU for that matter will beat the pants off of an equivalent 10th gen chip. None of the other games have such a dramatic win for the newest 15P, but there is a noticeable benefit right across the board with average frame rates being 5% and 10% higher. I'm pretty certain that gap would narrow even more if this laptop would have a 1440p display. But maybe the bigger story here is the increase in 1% lows, which tend to be influenced a bit more by the CPU, and for the most part, that's where the biggest overall frame rate jumps come from. Now, the last thing I want to touch base on is battery life, and it's here at the end of this video since it's a bit tough to make a direct comparison, and that's mostly because the older 15P, the 2020 model, has a smaller battery than the 2021 15P. Not by much, but even then, 5 watt-hours can play a role in influencing these tests. But overall, it doesn't look like this generation is all that much more efficient than the last one when running unplugged. I mean, sure, the newer 15P got a bit better result, but the gap isn't big enough to convince me this isn't due to a simple variance or some other factor. I mean, if anything, these results with such a large battery are actually a bit disappointing when you consider some 15-inch gaming laptops are getting over 10 hours in our web browsing test these days. So that pretty much covers everything I've got to say, guys. It's actually super eye-opening to see the newest generation of CPUs compared to a similarly equipped device running an older chip, like a 2020 laptop. I actually went into this video with pretty low expectations, since if you look on the desktop side, the 11th gen Rocket Lake chips ended up without any real advantage versus the 10th gen desktop processors. But I can't say the same thing for laptops because, you know, the performance increase, especially in gaming, is absolutely incredible. I personally think this is the jump that Intel actually needed to become more competitive. So just don't judge a book by its cover and assume that everything happened on the desktop side is being mirrored into laptops, because that's really not the case. So on that note, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're able to take away everything that you needed to know about Intel's 10th gen laptop CPUs compared to 11th gen. Let us know what you guys think about the performance results. Are you impressed? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. I'm Ibra with hardwarecanucks. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.